Hello again. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, our two main sources into Old Norse myths. Um, our two main written sources, that is. And now, in the year 1643 AD, the Bishop of Iceland, Brynjolf Sveinsson, received into his hands an ancient manuscript made out of hides and leathers. The history of the survival of this manuscript is clouded in mystery. You see, the manuscript that we now today know as the Poetic Edda had been hidden away for centuries, and it was ancient even then, more than 400 years old. A few pages have been torn out of the book, but otherwise it was very well preserved. Now, when the Bishop Brynjolf opened the pages of the book and started to read, he instantly knew that he was holding a treasure, a grand heritage of the pagan past. Known and unknown myths, tales of gods and heroes sprang to life from the old pages, and the bishop decided that it must have been written down by the learned monk Semund the Wise some 400 years earlier. So he named the manuscript Samundar Edda, which means the Edda of Samund. But when he sent it to his king, the Danish king Frederick, he called it the Codex Regius, the Royal Codex. Now, the manuscript was held in Denmark until quite recently when it was returned to Iceland. How the manuscript had been preserved before, how it had been hidden, or even used throughout the 4 or 5 centuries of oblivion, is unknown to us. The book had been hidden away from the public eye for centuries before its keepers, some Icelandic family of farmers, judged it safe to show to the clergy. The manuscript, known to us as the Poetic Edda or the Elder Edda, contains a wealth of poems about pagan gods and heroes, written in the old allusive style of metaphors, where each stanza and each sentence, even the names of characters, should be read as parables. Whereas the manuscript dates back to the 12th century, it seems to have been a copy of an even older collection, now lost. The mythical contents of this lore is deeply pagan, possibly the reason why it had been hidden for so long. Okay, Snorri Sturluson. He was an Icelandic scholar, a chief, and the famous writer of the saga of the Norwegian kings. He was born in 1179 and died in 1241 AD. This learned writer lived in a time when the ancient traditions of Old Norse poetry were about to be forgotten, basically because the people were forgetting the meaning behind poetic metaphors. Now, Snorri, the poems of the Poetic Edda, they would have probably have been almost incomprehensible to us today if it had not been for the masterpiece of Snorri Sturluson known as the Prose Edda. You see, the Prose Edda is a collection of 3 books called the Gylfaginning, the Skaldskaparmål, and the Hattatal. The 2 first books contain a wealth of information about Old Norse myths. Their titles, Gylfaginning, meaning the visions of the wizard, and Skaldskaparmål, meaning the creation of bards. And they were written down sometime between 1220 and 1225 AD, and their purpose was to give an explanation of the metaphors and the allusions that carried Old Norse poetry. As Snorri Sturluson himself wrote it, he said, "I wrote this book so that young students of poetry may understand that which is hidden in runes." His book was an attempt to preserve allusive poetry. This was in 1220 AD. Snorri Sturluson realized that the last 220 years of Christian culture was beginning to diminish the quality of the ancient art of poetry, simply because the people were forgetting the meaning behind the metaphors. They were forgetting the mythology of the past. So, in a grand effort to re-establish the national poetic traditions, he wrote a book about it and divided it into 3 parts. And the first 2 parts of the book explains all kinds of traditional poetic metaphors through an extensive narration of pagan mythology. Snorri hoped for a revival of the glorious poetic past, but it did not happen. The pre-Christian mythology was no longer common knowledge, no longer living myths, even if certain learned people could read about it in a book. Yet, the gift Snorri gave to the later generations is invaluable, for without his book we would know sadly little of our pagan past, because we would have not understood nothing about the wealth of poetry left by ancient bards. Snorri's book was to be known as the Edda. Many speculations have been made as to the title, and at one time it was suggested that the Edda is a Norse version of the Indian Veda, not without good cause, yet we do not have to go further than to the Norse language itself to find the meaning. Edda simply means great-grandmother, a fitting title for the book that, at the time it was written, described beliefs still remembered by very old people. The manuscript of pagan poems found by Bishop Brynjolf some 400 years later was called the Elder Edda, because it was indeed older than the Snorri's Edda. The Elder Edda is also called the Poetic Edda, as opposed to Snorri's Prose Edda. And these two Icelandic masterpieces, written down during the late 13th and 12th centuries, are almost all we have to base ourselves on when studying Norse mythology. Other sources are the sagas that sometimes describe and more often hint at pagan beliefs and activities, as well as certain handwriting that adds to the Edda material with some stories and poems of the same genre, like the Raven spell song of Odin and the Song of the Sun, poems that were created and written down during the long era of transition between worldviews. Because it was a long era, it was 200 years before people were beginning to forget. Then, of course, we have the Danish writer Saxo Grammaticus, who was a contemporary of Snorri and who wrote the history of the Danish people in Latin. But it was including a wealth of legendary and mythical material closely related to the mythology behind the Eddas. Yet Saxo's work is not as fully appreciated as the Icelandic manuscript, firstly because Saxo wrote in a foreign language, and secondly because he wrote in a less exciting way, and thirdly because of his moralistic and condemning approach to everything pagan. He did, however, render the complete Danish legend of Hamlet, thus being a major contributor to the later work of Shakespeare. Now, the Eddas have been discussed and disputed among scholars for centuries. The question is, almost more or less thus, may the Eddas really be used as a reliable source to actual pagan mythology? Are the poems of the Elder Edda actually pagan poems, orally transmitted until they were faithfully written down by Christian descendants? Or were they created after the fall of paganism? Does Snorri really relate myths that go back to pagan times, or did he simply invent them or rewrite the stories to his liking? The only answer one may give for sure is that the mythology rendered in these texts do have their obvious archaeological counterparts in the imagery of the pagan predecessors, so that at least they were based on actual pagan myths. Whether the poems and the narratives are authentic is impossible to answer for sure. From my own studies of the myths, I believe the texts are as true to authentic paganism as they possibly could be after its downfall. Before the age of writing, oral transmissions was a powerful tool, and professional bards were taught to remember. Snorri himself claimed to have used sources like old men and women who still knew the old ways. And several scholars have pointed out that pagan ideas were extremely long-lived after the introduction of Christianity in Scandinavia. It is plausible that the learned people of the 13th century still had access to old and genuinely pagan poetry. For a long time, it was common to believe that the Poetic Edda was a random collection of older and newer poems or versions of poems put together by one or more learned monks in the 12th century. And now several poems are so complicated that scholars believe they present a jumble of different poems almost randomly put together. Lately, however, it has been suggested by some that the Poetic Edda, especially the poems about the gods, do fit together as if the collection of poems was meant as a book, complete in itself. And that the entire collection of poems actually fit together as if it was meant as one history carrying the same theme. And some people, one Berg, she concluded that the Poetic Edda must be the work of a 13th century author basing himself on the imagery of past mythology, yet creating a whole new and different universe, inspired mainly by the poetic fashion of medieval Christian mystic traditions. And this suggestion has provoked other scholars who believe that the poems are more deeply rooted in paganism. Well, I agree with Berg in one point only. I too believe that the poems of the Edda are, if not written by the same author, put together in order to make one complete book. I believe they were put together by an editor or group of editors that knew what they were doing. Editors who, regardless of their faith, held a profound knowledge of the pagan mythology and what it really meant on some level. They put poetry, what I believe must be genuinely and essentially pagan poetry, together in an order and a fashion that would convey the entire teaching of pagan mysteries, and yet hide it to those uninitiated. That's all I want to say about this.